Okay, today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Kaftet. Today's daf is dedicated by Judy Farber in memory of her father, Hershel Tzvi Shlomo Chaim Ben Pesach V'Dina Sarah Zichrono Levracha, on his third yurtzeit. And by Leah Ackner in honor of her son, Zev Yehuda Loring, becoming a bar mitzvah. Today I learned the daf in your honor and in honor of our past year of learning together to prepare for. And by Candace Herman Plotzker in honor of her mother, Elaine Riff, Alana, Leah, Bat Esther, and Meir on her 95th birthday. She's a creative, lifelong learner who's inspired me to pursue and embrace serious, challenging Torah learning. I look forward to attending live rather than Zoom shiurim with her soon. Happy birthday. Okay, and Mazal Tov on the bar mitzvah. Okay, we're going to start at the bottom of Kaf Chet Amud Bet. Today we're going to continue along the same style of yesterday's daf. Maybe not the easiest style to follow, but it's all about foods that we eat. We're going to talk about the issue of food relating to, number one, Eruv. That's our main purpose. The whole question is, how much food does one need for the purposes of Eruv? If it's a particular type of food, what foods can be used, how much we need. Generally, the shiur is 2 seudots worth. Why 2 seudot? And then the question is just going to be, by each food, how do we determine 2 meals worth? What if it's an item that's eaten with other things and it's not eaten by itself? So how much would 2 meals worth of that be? That's one issue. Why 2 meals? So the Rambam in the Perush HaMishnah says very simply, in those days, they ate 2 meals a day, even though we're talking about making an Eruv for Shabbat. And on Shabbat, they ate 3 meals, but 2 meals is the general amount that a person ate every day. They only ate 2 meals a day. And therefore, it's the general amount of food one would need for a day. And that's why that's the amount of food needed. Because the Gemara starts mentioning food, as the Gemara almost always does when food is mentioned, starts talking about how good certain foods are for your body, how dangerous they might be, right? Nutritional information. They want to tell you other things besides just the halacha. They want you to know, is this food healthy? Is it not? Will it kill you? Will it not kill you? We're going to start right away with something that kills you. And we're going to see that they even had, we have all these adages or quips, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. So they had their own also, and you can see that they rhyme and that it's a way that people will remember these things, that they're catchy. Okay, so we'll see a bunch of those. And in addition, they get into the shiur for foods in other cases and sometimes compare, or just they're listed together and they learn from one to the other. So we're going to talk about food when it comes to other halachot as well, like carrying on Shabbat. What's considered a significant amount of food that you're going to be obligated if you take something from the private to public, or liquids, how much messes up a mikvah, or all sorts of other tumat ochlin for impurity of food. So we're going to talk about all sorts of other things. That's why there's a basic structure, but we're going to get off on a lot of tangents. So starting from the last line, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Ma'arvim bitchadim chayim. You can use beets, raw beets, for your Eruv. Okay, they're called tradim, which sounds like spinach because of the Swiss chard that grows out of the beets. Ini, is that really true? V'hamar Rav Chisda, silka chaya katil gavra chaya. Here's your first adage, okay? Silka chaya katil gavra chaya, that means raw beets will kill a live person. It's like live beets. In Hebrew, the word for raw is alive. So it's a kind of joke or a play on words of, if you eat it raw, it will kill you if you're alive. So what do they answer? It's not actually raw when they say that. It's when it's partially cooked. Partially cooked is when it's actually dangerous and could cause death. But if it's totally raw, then it's okay. And that's what Rav Hamnuna said you can make an Eruvin, if it's totally raw. Ike de Amre, a different version of this whole discussion, was as follows. Amar Rav Hamnuna, ein ma'arvim b'tchadim chayim. He actually said the opposite. You can't use raw beets for your Eruv. Amar Rav Chisda, as Rav Chisda says. Now Rav Chisda here is brought as proof. Silka chaya katil gavra chaya. It's dangerous. And then the Gemara asks, what do you mean? We see people who eat this and they don't die. So how can you explain that? And then the answer, it's dangerous when it's partially cooked, right? The conclusion is the same. It's just a matter of how they got to it. Amar Rav Chisda. Now, once we have this, Rav Chisda now tells you, if you make a cooked dish with these beets, and here comes the rhyme. Okay, it's good for the heart, good for the eyes, and all the more so for your intestines. Amar Abaye, v'hu diyativ, and Abaye adds, if you remember, we learned this already, v'hu diyativ abe tafe, if it's by the oven, the oven tuch tuch, and it makes a tuch tuch sound, meaning if you cook it very well and it's boiling a lot. Amar Rava, Hareini kiben azai, we have another interesting statement here. Rava says, Hareini kiben azai b'shukei Tveria. I'm feeling in a very good mood today. I'm like Ben Azai in the shuk of Tveria. You can ask me any question and I'll answer it. Now, it's kind of a funny thing to say when you see what actually happens. So Rabbi comes along and asks him, Tapuchim bekama, how many apples do you need for your Eruv? Again, we're back to the question of Eruv. Amar le, v'chima arvim b'tapuchim. So now it's funny. He says, I'll answer any question. Here comes the question. And instead of answering with an answer, this is classic, right? If they say, if somebody asks you something you don't know the answer to, well, just answer back with a question. So he answers back with a question. And he says, can you actually make an Eruv with apples? Now, this is a very strange question because why wouldn't you be able to use apples for an Eruv? So there's a whole discussion among the commentaries. What is he talking about? Some people say he's talking about wild apples that people don't really eat. Some people saying apples are dessert food and maybe you can't make an Eruv out of dessert food. There's different opinions as to why exactly he would suggest that tapuchim you can't make an Eruv with. So the student answers him back, or the rabbi answers him back and says, and some people say, by the way, that what he was trying to do was to question the student and see if the student knew. Okay, he was kind of asking the question back to see if the student actually knew to answer him properly, as in that he knew you do make an Eruv on tapuchim, but instead of answering him, he said, well, do you make an Eruv? So that the student would say, oh yeah, I do know the answer to this question. Yes, you do make an Eruv on apples. So here we're going to see, so the student says below, why not? V'hatnan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah? Kola ochalin. Now first we're going to learn the Mishnah, then the Gemara is going to try to figure out from where exactly in this Mishnah do we learn the halacha. There's 3 different halachot here about food, as I said. Since we're talking about food, we're going to mention a few different other topics relating to food. If you eat a chatzi pras, a half a loaf of something that's impure, you yourself become impure. And what does that mean that you're impure? Well, this is the thing. Food, we've learned many times, can only be a rishon or a sheni. Now, a rishon or a sheni, letuma, can only bring tuma to other foods, okay? Not to people. So this seems like a strange thing. So how do you become impure? Well, the rabbis instituted that if you eat, they didn't want people to be involved with impure foods. So they said, if you eat impure foods, even though technically speaking, you don't become impure, we're going to call you impure for the purposes that you cannot eat truma. So if you're a Kohen and you ate impure food, you're not allowed to eat truma until you go to the mikveh. So that's what we're talking about here. How much food you have to eat. It's not the typical kizayit, it's more than that. It's a chatzi pras, a half a loaf of bread, that will, or the size of a half a loaf of bread, that will make you tameh. So now, does it have to be only one item of food in that shiur? No. The Mishnah says, you can eat a lot of different foods if they're all tameh and they add up to a chatzi pras, they all combine together. Ubimazon shtei sudo le'eruv, for eruv also, any food can combine. Uchebeitza l'tameh tumat ochlin, and when it comes to tumat ochlin, now there's always a debate when we talk about a kibetza for tumat ochlin. Everybody agrees that you need a kibetza if, your food, let's say, became tameh from an avatuma. An avatuma touched your food's tameh. It can now be metame other foods. Now, the question is, the shiur of a kibetza, for what is it significant? There's 2 things. One is to become impure, and the other is to pass on impurity. So everyone agrees that if this food is going to pass on impurity to some other food by, let's say, coming in contact with it, then it has to have a kibetza in order for it to work, for it to be pass on impurity. Other people say that it's both, okay? It's both to become tameh. Some people say no, to become tameh, if I touch food and I'm tameh, I can get food, it doesn't need to have a kibetza. A kibetza is the size of an egg. It's like double the size of an olive. So some people say to become tameh, it also needs a kibetza, okay? In any case, whether we view it as that one or that one, either which way, the idea here is that different foods can combine. So if I have a pile of a bunch of different foods and they were tameh, and then they, in order to pass on impurity, something else, they need to have a kibetza, even if it's a bunch of foods altogether. Okay. This is really talking about foods joining together. But if you notice, the wording used was kol ha'ochalin, all foods, as if it includes all foods, which would then seem to include, since it says mazon shtei sudot, we would assume that means also for eruv, that any food can work. So now they're going to say, my tiyuvta. So how did the student answer him from this source? Ilema mishum de katani, right? The obvious would be kola ochalin, right? It says kola ochalin can be mitzdareh for the 2 meals for the Eruv. Sounds like including, right? V'hanei b'nei achilaninu, and apples are obviously food. So that should work. But you can't say that because remember what we learned in the beginning of the chapter. But remember, you can't learn from general principles. Just because it says all foods doesn't necessarily mean it means all foods. Maybe apples are an exception to the rule. But they say, well, let's learn from here. It's juxtaposed to that case. Now, apples, nobody says that apples don't become impure. Of course, apples can become impure. If they can become impure, then they must be also used for the Eruv because they're mentioned right next to each other. And that's how he proves it from here. Now, you would expect at this point, Rava would give an answer, but he doesn't, okay? It's actually not, I should say, it's not 100% clear that the student answered Rava back. It could be the Gemara is just telling us this. Okay, in other words, maybe the story ends with the Rava asked the question back to the student. There's different ways you could read this sugya. But either which way, it's interesting that Rava never answers the question, especially after he said, oh, I'll answer any question. I'm like Ben Azai in the Shuk of Tiberia, and I can answer anything, and he doesn't answer in the end. Bekama, so how much? Amar Rav Nachman, we get an answer from Rav Nachman. Instead, tapukhim bekav. Okay, a kav is a measurement of volume, the measurement of a kav. Meitive, so now they ask a question. It says in the following source, and we're going to see a number of sources where Shimon ben Elazar appears relating to food. Rabbi Elazar Omer. He's talking here. The context here is Maser Ani. Maser Ani is in the 3rd year. Remember, we were talking about Maser Sheni the last few days. Now we have Maser Ani, which is in year number 3 and year number 6. Instead of bringing your Maser, that extra Maser, to Jerusalem, you actually give it to poor people. So now, someone's standing in his storage house giving out his food. And a lot of poor people come to get their Maser Ani. So how much does he give to everyone? You have 2 choices. You can either split everything up equally, or you can give more to some people and less to others. So the halacha says you can't give less than a certain amount of certain foods, right? Of this food, certain amount of this food, this for that, has to be significant. You can't, if you split it up and everyone ends up with such a small amount, that's not appropriate. You have to give everybody something. So you might give less people, but at least you have to give a minimum shiur. So what's the shiur? So in this Braita, we're going to see a bunch of shiurim for certain foods, and we're going to see soon a Mishnah where there's other ones listed. Uchla tavlin, okay, it's not so clear what this uchla is. Some people say it's 1/8 of a log of spices. Litra yerek, a liter of vegetables. Asara egozim, 10 walnuts. Chamisha farsekim, 5 peaches. Ushne rimonim, 2 pomegranates, ve'etrog echad, and 1 etrog. Okay, etrog, I assume, is just worth more money, so therefore, even though you wouldn't necessarily eat it, but it's worth more money. Topher, thank you for quoting that. I forgot to mention. A log, right, that's the shiur for a kav, is 4 log, which is 1.5 to 2.5 quarts, or 2.6 quarts, just to give you a sense. Okay. Va'amar Gorsak Bardari Mishmei de Rav Menashe Bar Shuguvli. Okay, interesting names here. So Gorski, or Gorsak, the son of Dre, says in the name of Rav Menashe Bar Shuguvli, Mishmei de Rav, in the name of Rav, that on this Mishnah, on this Braita, Rav said, B'chein la'eruv. All these shiurim for Maser Ani, what's considered important, are the same measurements for Eruv. So now they say, "V'hane nami lehavi ki afars." How do we get to this? Because we had an issue with the apples. Remember, we said how many apples, and he said tapuchim bekav, a kav of apples, so 1 to 1.5 to 2.5 quarts. But then they say, "V'hane nami lehavi ki afarsikim." Aren't apples kind of like peaches? Wouldn't you think it would be the same measurement? And peaches, we said 5 peaches. That's less than 1.5 to 2.5 to 2.6 quarts. So they say, no, because hane chashive v'hane lo chashive. Peaches are more valuable than apples. And that's why, right, they're more important. So 5 is already significant, whereas by apples, it's not as significant. But now going back to the fact that Rav Shaguvli said, that Rav said, v'chein la'eruv on that Braita, Rav Yosef disagrees with him. I'm a Rav Yosef, and he says in a very strong language, and it seems a little strange, he's so strong about this, Sharle Mari le Rav Menashe Bar Shuguvli. God should, right, like Hashem Yishmor, the way we say, right? God should protect him. God should pardon him for what he did, okay, as if it was this terrible thing he did. Ana amarita niale amatnitin, v'hu amara abraita. I said that Rav said it on the Mishnah, and he said that Rav said it on the Braita. Now, you might say, what's the big deal? And we're going to see the Mishnah is not so different from the Braita, and the Gemara is going to have to say, what's really the difference, and why are you making a big deal about this? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, in other words, Rav said somewhere, and just like this is Eruv. And about matnot aniyim, what the minimum amount you have to give to a poor person. But Rav Shaguvli said that he said it on the Braita. I'm sorry, Rav Menashe Bar Shaguvli said he said it on the Braita, and Rav Yosef said he said it on the Mishnah. So here's the Mishnah. Ditnan, ein pochatin la'ani begorem mechatzi kav chitin v'kav sorim. Notice there's different food measurements here. We didn't have chitim and sorim, wheat and barley. So it has to be a half a kav of wheat and a kav of barley, because barley was less significant, so you need more of it. Rabbi Meir Omer chatzi kav sorim. He says a half a kav of barley is enough. V'kav v'chetzi kosmin. If it's spelt, then it's 1.5. V'kav grogrot. If it's figs, then it's a kav. O maneh dvela, or a maneh, which was a certain measurement of the pressed figs. Rabbi Akiva Omer pras. He thinks half of a maneh of a dvela. He's going to say half, basically, to all the upcoming measurements. Chatzi log yayin, according to Tanakama. Remember this because we're going to come back to this. Chatzi log of yayin. Okay, when generally we talk about liquid measurements, we generally talk about a revi. A revi means a quarter. What's it a quarter of? A quarter of a log. So here we have 2 quarter logs, which is a half a log. That makes sense because it's 2 shiurim, right? 2 meals worth. So that's what we said, 2 seudot. So 2 revi'iyot of yayin. Rabbi Akiva omer revi'it. Rabbi Akiva thinks half. A revi'it of yayin is enough. Revi'it shemen, we're back to Tanakama, a quarter log of oil. Rabbi Akiva omer shminit, an eighth of a log. Ushar kol perot, what about everything else? Amar Bashaul, Kadeshi im Karem v'yikach b'mazon shtei seudot. The amount that if you would sell it, you'd be able to buy 2 meals worth. V'amar Rav, and here comes Rav Yosef, and he says, on this Rav said, v'chein la'eruv. So now the Gemara asks, what's really the difference, right? It's basically saying it's the same shiur for matnot aniyim that it is for eruv. So who cares whether he said it on the Mishnah or the Braita? Umay umay dahai mehach. What's better about saying it on the Mishnah than the Braita? Maybe you want to say it's because in the Braita it mentions spices, and spices, you need something that's actually food. Spices are not food, and you can't make an eruv, so you didn't want people to think that you could use spices for an eruv. But that's not a good answer because atu hacha milo katani, but in the Mishnah also it lists items that you can't use for eruv. Chitim v'sorin, t'lav b'nei achilaninu. Wheat and barley, we're talking about kernels of them. You can't eat those, and therefore you can't use them for eruv. Remember we said eruv has to be ready for use right now, even though you can eat them if you process them, but it has to be ready for eating right now. So therefore, it can't be, it's because there's some things listed that aren't part of eruv, because also in the Mishnah. Ela mishum dekatane chatzi log yayin. V'amarav ma'arvim b'shtei revi'iyot shel yayin. Midbina kulehai shmamina ki amarav v'chein le'eruv ahamat nitin kamar shmamina. The chiddush here is normally you only need a revi'it of yayin. And in the Mishnah, it said a chatzi log of yayin for a poor person. Okay, if you're going to give a poor person wine, it has to be a half a log. And Rav wanted to say the same thing, that for eruv, pay close note that it's 2 revi'iyot, a half a log of yayin, and therefore he wanted you to know that wine is more than the typical. For eruv, you need 2 revi'iyot, half a log, and that's why he wanted it to be said on the Mishnah and not the Braita, because the Braita didn't mention anything about wine. Okay, Amamar. It still seems a little bit strange that Rav Yosef came out so strongly against him because it wasn't like it's the biggest deal. But anyway, it's interesting to see how passionate he was about it. Amar. Now we're going back to something we said at the top of the page. We quoted a Braita in which it said, no, it was a Mishnah actually. Remember, Kol ochlim mitzrafim l'fsol ha'gviyah b'chatzi pras u'b'mazon shtei seudot le'eruv. So now they say, Sava Rav Yosef l'meimar ad di'ika seuda mehai u'seuda mehai. When he views shtei seudot, what he thought was, and again, whenever we see somebody thought, we're going to reject it. He thought that what we mean is one meal. Let's say you want to mix 2 different foods, so it has to be 1 meal's worth of one and 1 meal's worth of the other. Kind of like half a meal of this, half a meal of that, half a meal of that, half a meal of that. Now that's not going to work. But Amarle Rabba, afilu lemechze l'shlisha l'revia. No, actually you can. That's totally fine, which actually makes sense because our meals are a mix of all different foods, so it actually makes a lot of sense. Gufa. Now we're going to go in depth into another thing that we quoted before. Amarav, ma'arvim b'shtei reviyot shel yayin. Right? In order for you to do an eruv, you need 2, if you're going to use wine, 2 reviyits worth, a chatzi log, half a log, right? 2 quarter logs. Umi be'inan kulehai, do you really need that much? The Hatanya, doesn't it say in the Braita, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, yayin kedei le'echol bo, chometz kedei le'tabel bo, zeitim u'betzalim kedei le'echol bahem. Okay, 3 things here. The first one is obviously the important one. How much wine do you need? Okay, that you have to pay close attention to the wording. Kedei le'echol bo, in order to eat with it, meaning often people dip their bread. It doesn't sound like the most appetizing thing, but they dip their bread in wine. So, or dipped other food in wine. So the amount of wine that you would need at a meal if you were dipping your food into the wine. Now, obviously that is a lot less than a revi. If you're going to drink wine, so you're going to drink a cup, which is, right, a revi, we're going to call a cup. But if you're going to dip something in it, it's a lot less. So why they're now saying this seems to contradict what he says elsewhere. Okay, so now we're going to say, and Rav himself, right, this was, this goes against Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar in the Braita. Okay, remember I told you we're going to quote him a bunch of times here today. So he says, wine, the amount that you would basically dip your food into. Chometz kedei le'tabel bo. Also the same with vinegar. People would dip their food in vinegar, so the amount of vinegar that you would dip 2 meals worth into. Zeitim u'betzalim, olives and onions, kedei le'echol b'hem shtei sudot. Okay, they have the regular measurement of food. This was just part of the Braita. So what do they answer? Well, different types of wine. Hatam b'chamra mevashla. If you have yayin mevushal, wine that was cooked, that wine is much stronger, and therefore the amount to dip in would be sufficient. Whereas if you're talking about wine that you would normally drink that's less strong, that's not mevushal, not cooked, then it's going to be the regular revi'it, and then you need 2 revi'iyot for the shiur of 2 meals. Now we're going to go back to the other things mentioned in this list in this Braita. Amar Mar. Again, Amar Mar is, we're quoting something we said before. Chometz kedei le'tabel bo. Amar Rav Gidol Amarav, kedei le'tabel bo mazon shtei seudot shel yerek. He said, dip what? Dip 2 meals worth of vegetables. So take, if you were to eat just vegetables for your meal, the amount of vegetables that you would take and then dip, right? Let's say you're vegan and you're eating mainly vegetables. So what you would dip into vinegar. Ikeda Amre, some people say, Amar Rav Gidol Amarav, that what he said was not that. He said, yerek hanechal b'shtei seudot. It's the amount of vinegar that you would use to dip the amount of vegetables that you would eat in a regular meal, which is already much less. If you eat a regular meal with bread and other things, right? Remember, their meals always consisted of bread. When they say meal, they mean bread. So if you have bread with some vegetables on the side, and 2 meals worth of vegetables, right? The vinegar that you would dip 2 meals worth of vegetables into, which is much less. Amar Mar. Now we're going to go to this zeitim u'betzalim, and again we're going to get into unhealthy or dangerous, potentially dangerous foods. Kedei le'echol b'hem mazon shtei seudot. U'betzalim mima'arvin. You can make an eruv with onions. Now you might think, because people don't really eat raw onions or onions by themselves. Well, v'hatanya, that's not what the question's going to be. Doesn't it say in a Braita, Amar B'Shimon ben Elazar, Pam achat shavat Rabbi Meir ba'ardiska. Okay, we have a story. Rabbi Meir was in Ardiska for Shabbat. I wanted to go to the city of Tivon, and right now he was about probably halfway. He had already left. Okay, what happened was he put up an eruv before Shabbat, somewhere where he could then get to Tivon. He was now in a space where he was allowed to walk because of his eruv, but only because of his eruv. He had already left his city limits of 2,000 amma. But since he put an eruv, it was fine. But what happened? His eruv was with onions. So what did Rabbi Meir say to him? Rabbi Meir said, uh-oh, you made it with onions. Your eruv is no good. Right now you're stuck. You can't walk more than 4 amo. Because if you leave the Tchum Shabbat, you can't walk more than 4 amo. Where is this most relevant, by the way, Tchum Shabbat? This comes up in halachic issues. There's all different questions about whether you're actually outside the Tchum or whatever when you're in airspace. But if you're on a plane that lands on Shabbat, let's say you get stuck and something happens and it lands on Shabbat. So technically speaking, you can't leave more than 4 amot. You're stuck. You have to actually stay on the plane because you can't even leave. And then there's a debate about how we define your 4 amot, and there's all sorts of halachic issues of getting out of it, and maybe in the airspace you weren't outside the tchum. All different questions come up, but this is one of the ramifications of this issue, that if you leave the tchum Shabbat on Shabbat, let's say you left by accident, you're stuck. You can't walk more than your own space, basically. So that's what he said to him. So here you see, onions can't be used for an eruv. So what do we answer? Lo kashya, ha ba'alim, ha ba'imhot. There's the leaves and the bulbs. The onion bulbs are fine. You can make an eruv on them. It's the leaves that are a problem. Titania, as it says in the following Braita, achal batzal v'yishkim b'meit. Here's another kind of quip, and here it's interesting. It's in Braita. If you eat onions and in the morning you're dead, ein omwin mimam meit. Nobody asks questions like, what did he die from? It's quite obvious that it's the onions that caused your death. Again, it's another way of people saying these things so that you avoid certain foods. V'amar Shmuel, and Shmuel explained on that Braita, lo shanu ela ba'alim, aval b'imhot leit lamba. We're only talking about the leaves, not the bulbs. Uba'alim nami lo amhan. And now we're going to have all these limitations because it seems that maybe at some time they said this, but the rabbis later couldn't possibly fathom that this was dangerous. Okay, by the way, I want to point out, I see we have that there was a recall of white, yellow, and red onions in the United States a few weeks ago. And in fact, in the Koran, there's a good footnote that says that there are some danger. There's a dangerous, there's an oil, okay, called allyl propyl disulfide, okay, which gives them flavor, which can also be toxic in large concentrations. So there you have it. But in any case, what does he say? So here they try to limit it again because it doesn't seem to match their reality. Uba'alim nami lo amaran ela de lo ivtzil zerta. It's only if it didn't grow to the size of a zeret. Remember, that's a span from the thumb to the pinky, which is 21 centimeters. Aval ivtzil zerta leit lamba. Once it grows to that size, they're no longer toxic. Okay, I guess in small quantities, maybe there's a lot more concentration of it, of whatever is toxic in it, and it's dangerous. Amar papa lo amaran ela de lo ishte shichra. Aval ishte shichra leit lamba. Another thing we have is that it's only if you don't drink beer after, but if you drink beer, it counterbalances, it neutralizes the effects of the toxins in it. Okay, again, we're getting off on these asides about foods that are healthy or not healthy or dangerous or could cause your death. Toxic. Tanu Rabbanan, lo yochal adam batzal mipnei nachash shebo. So now another Braita about this, don't eat onions because of the snake inside. They don't really mean snake, that there's a snake inside the onion. What they mean is snakes have poison in them, also the onions. He ate a half an onion. Here you see it's not even in large concentrations. He ate a half an onion and half of the toxic stuff that was inside. And he was about to die. Right? So if you didn't believe us, here's a story. His friends prayed for him, and he was brought, right? He came back to life, or didn't die. He got better. Why was he saved? Because he was needed. Okay, the generation needed him. Okay, it sounds like that's why they prayed for him, because they really needed him, which is interesting because it sounds like, well, if they didn't need him, maybe they wouldn't have prayed for him, which is interesting. Maybe you could say they saw it as a sign of, death by the hands of God. I don't know, but they really needed him. So because of that, they prayed for him. So people ask, how could that be? Anyway, we'll leave it as a question. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Shmuel. Shechar ma'arvim bo uposel hamikvah v'shlosha login. Again, we're getting into both eruv and other topics that have to do with food. So if you have beer, you can use it for an eruv, and not only that, but it messes up a mikvah in the size of 3 log. And this is if you have a mikvah that's not yet 40 se'ah, and you pour 3 log of certain liquids, it messes up the mikvah. We've seen this before, right? If it changes the color, even if it doesn't change the color, there's different things. So this messes up a mikvah, whether or not it changes the color. If you pour 3 log in, it already messes it up. Matzah flour of kahana pshita. He questions and says, isn't this obvious? Why would it be obvious? If you have colored water, it messes up the mikveh. And why should beer be any different than colored water? And the assumption is beer is more significant than just colored water. And if colored water can mess up a mikveh, then at 3 log, then all the more so beer. Ditnan, how do we know this? Because it says, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Meitzeva poslin et hamikveh b'shlosha login. So what does the Gemara answer? Amrei ha tamayeg ditziva mikre. There it's called colored water. Maybe that's why, even if it doesn't change it, you put in colored water. And because it's called colored water, that's why it messes up the mikveh, because the color is important. But this is called beer. It's not called colored anything. And therefore, you might have thought maybe it doesn't mess up a mikveh. This again shows that for different things, what you call it is different, or what you might say beer is more important or significant, so all the more so it would mess up a mikveh. But when it comes to mikveh, maybe it's the color that's important and what it looks like. So therefore, something that's called colored water might be more problematic than something called beer. So for each issue, it's somewhat different. Okay, continuing on. Ubekama ma'arvin. So now that we have beer, how much? Savar Rav Acha Bered Rav Yosef Kamed Rav Yosef Lamemar. And I'll just preface this by saying there's a big lack of clarity about what this means. And Rashi explains one way, which seems to contradict the way Rashi explains this parts of the sugya somewhere else, which, by the way, makes sense. Rashi is not always consistent between different masechtot. Okay, when it comes up in Shabbat, he explains differently. The revid here is going to be used. Now, revid means a quarter. Literally, it means a quarter. Generally, when we say revid by drink, we mean a quarter of a log. But some people think that we mean a quarter of a kav, which is equal to one log. So Rashi's interpretation of revid here is a revid halog. Okay, and if you're using the Shanstein, that's what they go by. I'm going to go by that it's a revid of, I'm not sure what I said, a revid of a kav, which is a log. Okay, that it's not used in the regular way revid is used. I'm going to explain the Gemara differently, which is more the way the Koran goes with it, which is a revid is a revid, the regular revid, a quarter of a log, okay, which is the classic shiur for drinking. So how much do you need? So Savar Rav Acha Bered Rav Yosef Kamed Rav Yosef Lamemar Bitrein Revei Shechra. 2 revi'iyot of yain, again, so of beer. So again, either that's a chatzi log, it's just the same as the wine, or it's a 2 revi'iyot of a kav, which is going to be 2 log, just a lot more, obviously, 4 times. So kiditznan, and you'll see why they get confused here, because it's a little bit confusing. Kiditznan motzi yain kedem zigatakos. So again, we have a Savar Rav Acha Lamemar. He wanted to say, based on the following Mishnah, when you take wine out, how much wine do you, remember we talked about carrying on Shabbat. In order for you to be chayav for carrying, has to be something of significance. So how much wine do you have to carry? The amount of wine that you would need in order to make, dilute it, right? To undilute the wine and end up with a cup of wine. Okay, kedem zigatakos, because remember, they would use either 3 parts water or 2 parts water to 1 part of wine. So kedem zigatakos, v'tane ala kedem zigatakos yafeh. What does it mean, a cup? A nice cup. What is a nice cup? My kos yafeh, kos shel bracha. A cup that you would make a blessing on, meaning a nice full cup. V'amar Rav Nachman amar Rav Ravua, kos shel bracha. So how much is that? Tzarich sheyehe bo rova revi'it. Kedeshim again v'yamoda revi'it uchidara v'damarava kol chamer delodari al chad slat maya lav chamerhu. Okay, I read a lot, but I wanted to kind of get to the end. We'll start with Rava. Rava says, that's the last part we read, any wine that you don't put 3 parts water to is not considered wine, meaning you have to dilute it, right? 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Okay, there was a debate about 2 or 3. So first we're going to go like Rava, and then we're going to say, so what's the shiur to get to a cup of a bracha? Well, since it's 3 parts to 4, and generally the amount of a kos shel bracha is a revid of again, depending on how you understand, but let's just assume a revid of a log, quarter of a log. So how much wine do you need? How much wine are you obligated for carrying? A quarter of a log, right? Because a quarter of that is going to be diluted 3 times. You'll end up with a log. The katane seifa, and then it says in the end there, ushar kol hamashkim berevit. All other drinks, it's going to be revit, okay, a quarter of a log. The chola shofchim berevit, and if you're taking out wastewater, it's also going to be revit. Now, what's the ratio of beer to wine here? Well, wine, we said a quarter of a log, and beer, we said a quarter of a log. So the ratio is 1 to 4. So midahatam achad arba, hachanami achad arba. Since that's 1 to 4, what did Rav Yosef think? Rav Acha thought. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Yosef, he said in front of Rav Yosef, he said, I'm assuming that beer is going to be 4 times the amount of wine for the purposes of Eruv. What did we say by wine? How much wine? Half a log. So if you need half a log of wine, we're going to do 4 times the amount. You're going to need 2 log of beer in order to have an Eruv. But then they say, Velohi, but that's not true. Because hatam hu de b'tzir mehachi lo chashiv. If you took any less than 4 times the amount of wine for carrying, it wouldn't be significant. Aval hacha lo. But here not. Why? And it's here will be enough to have 2 cups because it doesn't go by what's significant. And as you don't need 4 times the amount of wine. There, if you don't have 4 times the amount of wine, it's not going to be anything. Less than a revi'it of beer is nothing. But when it comes to what we need, what do we need? Mazon shtei seudot. People generally drink a cup of beer in the morning or in the early afternoon and a cup of beer in the evening. And therefore, right, interesting, they drank beer during the day, but we knew that was their main drink, beer or wine. So therefore, we're going to say b'samche alayu, and this is what they would normally drink. And that's why it's not going to be 4 times the amount of wine when it comes to this issue. Okay, it's a bit of a tricky sugya because, and that's why Rashi has a different interpretation, because the wine we're talking about there is the concentrate, and here we're talking about the wine that's already diluted. So the whole sugya, I'll just put it out there, it's a little bit confusing. Tmarim bekama, how many dates does one need if you're using dates? Amar Rav Yosef tmarim bekav. Again, we have this measurement of a kav, the 1.5 to 2.6 liters. Again, why do I say 1.5 to 2.6? It's because all these measurements, there's a lack of clarity about what exactly they were. And there's always debates among the commentaries, how much it all stems from what are the size of the olives, what are the size of the eggs, did the sizes change, how big, there's all different debates, and there's always a range when we get to shiurim. It's not that it's from that to that, it's just that some people say that amount, some people say that amount, probably even there's some who say in the middle somewhere, although I'm not sure. So it's marim bekav. Amar Rav Yosef mina minala. Where do I get that from? Tanya, it says in the Braita, achal golgot v'shilem tmarim tavo alav bracha. Now, again, we're off on a different topic. If a Kohen, there's food that's truma. A Yisrael, a regular person can't eat truma, only a priest. If you're a Yisrael and you eat the truma of a Kohen, you have to return the value to a Kohen. So let's say you ate figs, but you paid back in dates. The Braita says you get blessed, meaning this was a super nice thing you did. Now, it seems very weird. Hey, chidami, what's the case? If it means you ate 40 shekels worth of, $10 worth of figs, and you return $10 worth of dates. So, that doesn't make any sense. The tavo ala bracha, right? If it's lefi damim, he gave the same value to achal mine bezuzah, he ate a zuz worth, the kamashalim le bezuzah, and he returned a zuz worth, my tavo ala bracha, bezuzah achal, bezuzah kamashalim. You gave back exactly what you took. There's no extra nice thing you did. Elalav, it must be lefi midah. Ta'achamine griva de grogro, de shav yazuza, the kamashalim le griva de tmarim, de shavu arba'a. Let's say it was a pound of figs that you ate, and you returned a pound of dates, and a pound of dates, let's say, are worth 4 times the amount of figs. They're just giving an example. And then, katane tavo ala bracha. Well, if that's the case, what do you see here? Alma tmarim adife. Tmarim are obviously more significant. Okay? So there you see, right? That's how I get the tmarim bekav. So Amar le Abaye, what are you talking about? La'olam de'achal minei bezuzah v'kamashalim bezuzah. No, it's that you ate a zuz and you returned a zuz. Go back to option number 1. My tavo ala bracha. We still have to explain why tavo ala bracha. De'achal minei, and here you get to business issues, right? This is all, learning about how supply and demand and all that. Midi dilo kafetz alei zvine. V'kamashalim le midi de kafetz alei zvina. You ate something. Figs are not so easily sellable. They might be worth the same value, and you gave back the exact same value, except that one has a better resale rate, right? You're going to much more easily sell your dates than you're going to sell figs. And because of that, if you gave him back dates, even in the exact same amount, you basically gave him something worth more. Okay, tavo ala bracha, because you ended up giving him something he's going to be able to sell much more easily. Shetita. Now we're up to shetita. We saw this before. It's a dish, Rashi says, that they made from roasted or toasted, which basically sweetens the flour, and with some honey in it. Okay, they would dry it out in the oven. They would put some honey in it. They make this dish. We learned about, we were talking about lash and mixing, kneading. Amar Rav Acha bar Pinchas, trei shagushe. It's 2 spoonfuls. Kisane, obviously what's a spoonful? Okay, big, right? But it's a type of spoon. I guess it was probably a measurement of a certain type of spoon. Kisane, these are roasted, toasted items. Amar Abaye, tre bune de pumpadita. This doesn't help us at all. 2 measurements of buni, which was a measurement in pumpadita. Okay, helps them, doesn't help us. Amar Abaye. Now we get to Abaye and all his nice statements he says in the name of his mother. Remember, it wasn't his mother, but it was his nursemaid. So, Amar Abaye, Amar Li'aim. Hi man de eat le chulsha de liba. If you have weakness of heart, Lete bisri de itma yamina, take the meat of the right calf of a dichra, of a ram. Velete kivuye de reuta de Nisan, take the dung from a cattle in the months of Nisan. Ve'ileka kibuye de reuta, if you can't find that, then lete sugiana de arvata, take twigs from an arava tree. So you should then boil, roast it up on that fire that you made, and then drink afterwards wine marca. What's marca? One second. Diluted wine. Okay. So drink diluted wine, and that will take care of your heart problems. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol Shuhu Liftan. Okay, now we get back to what we said before. If it's something that's eaten with bread, then it's the measurement of the amount that you would eat with 2 meals worth of bread. How much dip? Okay, let's say it's hummus, right? How much hummus would you eat with a meal's worth of bread? If you don't eat it with the bread, but you eat it by itself, then it's how much you would actually eat on its own in 2 meals worth. Basar chai, so raw meat, nobody ate that with bread. They would eat it by itself, and therefore, in order to eat with it. Here you see they ate raw meat sometimes. Basar tzli, if it's roasted meat, some people eat roasted meat on bread. Some people eat roasted meat by itself, right? Most of us eat it not with bread. But in those days, it seemed to be common that they would eat the meat on bread. Now, if you're eating meat on bread, it's going to be a lot less that you're going to eat for 2 meals worth, because 2 meals is more consisting of bread than of the meat. Rabba Amar, so there's a machloket. Rabba says, Kedei le'echol bo, to eat it with bread. For Rav Yosef Amar, Kedei le'echol himenu, in order to eat from it, meaning you would eat it by itself. Amar Rav Yosef, Menam min Allah, what's my proof? And we'll kind of end with this. Dahane parsai achle tapaki below nama, because they eat this type of meat without bread. So Amar le'abai, we'll end with this question. We'll end in the middle of his question. Just like we had with Bavel the other day. What? We're going by the Parsiim. Do they constitute the majority of the world? Why are we following what they do to decide how much meat one needs for an Eruv? And we'll end with this for today. We're going to pick up with, do we really follow the majority in cases like this or not? And how do we deal with that? Okay, have a good day, everybody.